Greetings, classicists, and welcome to Persian reality, the final element to the invention of the barbarian course. So let us make a start. So where will Persian reality come into the course? Well, it'll probably be used as evidence for a variety of different questions. So those sorts of questions will be things like, how accurate are Greek depictions of Persians? So you'd be comparing Herodotus, you'd be comparing Aeschylus, you'd be comparing Greek pottery with some of the Persian visual materials and a couple of other sources that we're going to study. So I think that'll be one area in which this question could be used. The other area is questions or ideas along the lines of how did the Persian Empire work. So you need to have an understanding of, and this is an outline understanding, we're not reading another kind of Herodotus length text or even an Aeschylus or Medea length text. It is a smaller, more compact module, and a question would probably be as simple as how did the Persian Empire work, and you'd look at some of the three leading kings that we are going to study. So it could be a standalone little type of question. So what do we really need to take away? Well, we need to take away a very detailed understanding of set visual materials and obviously the context that goes with it, because we don't have any text, but we do have a number of visual Persian materials that indicate the reality of Persia. Now, obviously, we need context to understand those materials. There are a few texts that I have included, even though they're not set, because again, I think they're really important for context and giving you the ability to understand what's going on. But there's no reason why you can't use them. They are ancient sources, and you'll get credit for using them in the exam. They're just not set texts, and that's something just to keep reminding you. The exam board has said time and time again they are providing the kind of minimum number of texts and sources, if you like, and if you bring in more, then you will get credit for it. So Persian reality is probably going to be used for a comparison with the Greeks and the accuracy of Greek depictions of the Persians, or maybe a kind of standalone 20-mark question on the kind of mechanics of Persian power and rule, and for that you use visual materials and context. But there's no reason why you couldn't use Herodotus, as many Persian scholars actually do. So that's where we're going with Persian reality. And this is not a set source, but it is an interesting little way to start in terms of visual materials. And this is a golden daric, a coin of King Darius. So if we think about the question that we were just asking, how accurate are the Greek depictions of the Persians, have a look at this coin produced by the Persians. To what extent does it match Greek stereotypes of Persians and kings? Well, let's have a look. So you've got the bow. So straight away we can see that symbol of Persian royalty that the Greeks disdain on the battlefield. The bow is there and prominent. And looking at Darius, and that's a coin of Darius. He's not carrying a sword. They've chosen to depict themselves as having a bow. And you can see the little arrows there. If you look on his head, you can see the crown. So again, that real reinforcement of wealth and status and hierarchy. Furthermore, you can see his soft flowing robes. So again, that crucial kind of element of the Greek depiction of Persians with their robes. And I don't think he's quite got trousers, as we can see here, but there is a sort of softness and a flowingness to these robes, which, as we've said before, makes a lot of sense if you're fighting in a desert, but perhaps less sense if you're fighting in a European valley against heavily armed hoplites. So it would seem that there's some connection to reality. Now, obviously, the way the Persians interpret the bow is different to the way the Greeks interpret the bow, but yet both agree that the bow is a symbol of royalty. The Greeks argue it's a symbol of weakness, and the Persians argue it's a symbol of strength. So moving on, before we move on, I suppose another thing to think about this is the degree to which the Greeks depict themselves on coins. Who gets put on a coin? If you look at a lot of Athenian coins, they've got signs of the goddess Athene, and they've got other sort of signs and symbols of Athens, so they've got owls and things like that, but they don't have individuals. So it's quite, is it quite hubristic in a sense to put your image on a coin from a Greek perspective? Maybe some Greeks do it, but I think the Athenians wouldn't have. So an interesting thing to consider, few Persian sources exist for the Greco-Persian Wars. So that's really the time period that we're covering, so 490, if you like, down to 479. I mean, you could go back to the Ionian Revolt, so 499 to 479. It still more or less holds true. Why are there so few Persian sources for this war? And there really aren't very many. So why do you think it is? Jot down a few ideas. Well, a couple of reasons, some of which are pretty obvious, one might argue. So first of all, the Persians were not keen to celebrate failure, and they failed. They intended to conquer Greece, and they were heavily beaten. They intended to enslave Ionia, and it was liberated. However, relatively briefly, the story gets a little bit more complicated. But fundamentally, they failed in their aims. So that's one reason. And royalty is not going to be advertising failure. The other perspective to consider is that this is not as significant to the Persians as it is to the Greeks. For the Greeks, this war with the Persians is fundamental to their identity, to the identity of a polis, but also to your identity as a Hellene, as a Greek. Athens changes after the Greco-Persian Wars. They start out as not a minor city at all, certainly a very significant city at the beginning, but nothing like as significant and as powerful and as culturally important as the end of the war. So the war revolutionizes, if you like, the significance of Athens and the significance of Sparta, and it fundamentally changes the Greek world, the war and its consequences. Whereas for the Persians, it is a war on the edge of their empire. Remember, it takes 3 months to march to Susa. So for a lot of the Persians, one could argue, although they would have been aware that this was a significant defeat, their empire is more or less intact. They've got rebellions, they've got revolts, they've got border wars with other people. It just isn't as significant to the vast majority of Persians. And of course, as we mentioned before, they lost. So it's not that significant. We lost. Shh. Now, I think the other area to consider is, and maybe this isn't quite the right expression, but Persian society amongst the royals, if you like, is in some ways less literate than Greek society. So the degree to which histories like Herodotus would actually be consumed and there be a desire to consume them, I think is significantly less in Persia. Now, we've got to be very careful about this Persian Empire because it's made up of all sorts of people, including Greeks, all sorts of people with interesting rates of, high rates of literacy and, a vast mishmash of very complex and ancient cultures, some of whom even wrote the first sort of story that we really have, that of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's not that you've got these sort of illiterate barbarians and literate Greeks on the one hand, much as the Greeks would probably like you to believe. I think it's just the importance of literacy and literature in the sort of ruling classes, if you like. So how important is it to the Persians in charge of this kind of mishmash empire that there is a sort of vast Persian history produced? Probably not so much as it is for the Greeks and their policies and their kind of celebration of a shared identity, which is also based on literature. If you think back to the significance of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the things that binds the Greeks together is literature, but I would argue that's not the same for the Persians and the Persian Empire. So there are far fewer Persian sources than there are Greek ones, and almost no significant, let's say no significant sources that discuss the Greco-Persian Wars. So let's think about the nature of these Persians. So the Persians were a nomadic horse riding tribe in their very origin, and they started out as a sort of relatively loose ethnic group. So they sort of coalesce into a more definable, Persian. But again, very initially, before they have their empire, it's a sort of loose coalition of horse nomads. They travel in from the steppes and set up a kingdom in southwest modern-day Iran, and that kingdom are vassals of the Median Empire. So remember, the Medes, who own half of modern-day Turkey, the eastern half of modern-day Turkey, and then you've got the Lydians in the, hang on, am I getting confused? The Lydians on the sort of Ionian side, and then the Medes further west. So that means that they are a sort of subject people of the Medes. Relatively small tribe, and this is, so that they have these really very humble origins, and they explode almost out of nowhere, it would seem. So what I would like you to do is watch again Who Were the Persians by Llewellyn Jones. Now, we've watched this before, you've taken notes before, but it's so good, and I want you to do it again, and I want you to identify those key points of argument where he talks about who were the Persians, but again have these questions running through your mind. How does this compare to the Greek depictions of them? But also think about this kind of interaction with Greeks. What is it about the Persians that would shock the Greeks, horrify the Greeks, please the Greeks? Similarities between the two cultures as much as anything. So stop, have a go at that. It's only 6.5 minutes long, but you've got time to stop, pause, and do whatever it is that you need to do. I will put the link up in the assignment, but obviously you can go to the Massalit and look at Llewellyn Jones's section and watch the Who Were the Persians video. So, having watched the video, a couple of questions to think about. What would the Greeks have thought of the Persians' nomadic origins and culture? Which two other barbaric cultures were nomadic? What would be the impact of their geographical origins on Greek perceptions of them? So the fact that they are in southwest Iran, how would that influence the Greek understanding of them? But also, why were they called the Medes by the Greeks? So if you remember back to Aeschylus and Herodotus, often the Medes is a sort of slang or simple way of referring to the Persians, even though actually we know they are quite different ethnic groups. So stop the video and jot down some ideas for each one of these. Good. So what would the Greeks have thought of the Persians' nomadic origins and culture? Well, not a lot, I think, is the short answer. So I think the simple difference here, and I think Llewellyn Jones points this out in the video, is in a sense they are worlds apart. You have got one culture that fundamentally defines itself by the polis, by the fixed city of which you are a citizen member, and that contributes to your political identity, social identity, religious identity. It is all fundamentally done through the polis, and the polis is more than the buildings. The polis is the buildings and the systems of the city-state. And then on the other hand, you've got nomadic tribes with no city and arguably not much of a state. And for the Greeks, almost everything really all signs of civilization, if you look, many signs of civilization are intricately bound with the polis. So you've got you've got religion. There are real elements of celebrating as a polis in specific sites and sanctuaries and places. The location of these things is absolutely crucial. You've got politics that takes place, and then the physical location of politics. For the Athenians, the Democratic Assembly on the Pnyx. You've got, I suppose, a kind of a sense of your identity being bound to the geography. So for the Athenians, it's sailing. For the Spartans, their whole culture is arguably dedicated towards defending this particular piece of land and this particularly fertile, beautiful valley. And in a sense, all of the way they structure their society comes from that. And so to have these Persians kind of wandering around hills and valleys and no fixed space is very, very different. Perhaps we could also argue that the Greek understanding of the role of women is based on them being fixed in a particular secure location. Especially in Athens, where they're sort of almost walled into a fortified compound in the, more the wealthier families. Obviously, the lower class families like to do that, but simply can't afford it. And then whereas for these nomadic tribes, you've got women wandering around on horseback, out in public, because that's a necessary part of moving as a nomadic tribe. So, I don't think you can express enough the significance of that difference between the Greeks and the Persians. Now, which two other barbaric cultures were nomadic? Well, you've got the Scythians, wild, strange, exotic warriors, and of course, you've got the Amazons, at least initially. Now, the Amazons do have a city of Themyscira, but fundamentally they're considered to be nomadic and sort of horse-riding nomads. So horse-riding nomads are almost the epitome of savagery and exotic barbaric strangeness as far as the Greeks are concerned, because they don't have a polis and they don't fight in the hoplite phalanx. So what would be the impact of the geographical origins on Greek perceptions? Well, it's far away. It's very far away from Greece. It is far, far out east to a place where very few Greeks would have ever been. Perhaps some traders. It's not impossible that Greeks could go there and would have got there. And if you've got Ionian Greeks, they're part of the way there already. But they are far away. They are from the exotic, mystical east that most Greeks would have only known through stories of travellers. So they do have that sort of physical location beyond reality, much like the Ethiopians in Homer's Odyssey, one might argue. So why were they called the Medes? Well, they were called the Medes because they take over the Median Empire, and the Greeks just get a bit confused. Also, as Llewellyn-Jones says, that they come from the same sort of cultural group, and they split into Medes and Persians, and then the Persians kind of reunite them again. So I think it's very similar if you're doing medieval history to the Muslim word for crusader, which was Frank, basically. So they assumed that all Crusaders were more or less French, even though that wasn't true. So it happens when you've got this cultural group that you don't really understand. You seize on one word, call them that, and off you go. So let's have a look now at our first key Persian and the first great Persian, one might argue, and that is Cyrus II, or otherwise known as Cyrus the Great. And he had a sort of a relatively long and glorious rule, and he put Persia on the map. He takes Persia from this vassal tribe to this vast empire, really. Now, others do add to it, but Cyrus is what makes Persia, and the Greeks had a huge amount of respect for Cyrus. Now, Cyrus started off as a vassal king of the Medes, so he owed allegiance and obedience to this bigger Median empire, and he decided that he didn't like that. So he assembled an army and fought the king of the Medes, and he defeated him and took over the empire. So the Persians fused the empire, or the area that the Persians had, I wouldn't call it an empire, with the empire of the Medes. And he showed some pretty sensible leadership. He obviously acknowledged that the Medes were a similar cultural group, so he married his daughter off to some of the leading Median, well, not some, to one of the leading Median nobles, and really focused on uniting the people as a almost not quite a homogenous cultural group, but it wasn't these Medes are slaves. It was these Medes are like us. We need to form a kind of united empire. So important cultural understanding, and not this pressing desire to enslave everyone all the time. So once Cyrus had taken the Median Empire, he then turns his eye to Lydia. Now, Lydia, if you remember, is the kingdom that King Croesus, who we looked at the beginning of the course, controls. And King Croesus, remember, he goes to the oracle and says, should I attack? Because he's worried about the growing power of Persia. And the oracle says, if you do, a great empire will fall. And he goes, oh, brilliant, it'll be the Persians. So he charges off and loses. And as a result, Cyrus takes Lydia. Now, before this happens, interestingly, Cyrus did try to get the Ionian Greeks to betray Croesus. Remember, Croesus, as the king of Lydia, did control these Ionian Greek cities, but the Ionian Greeks remained loyal to Croesus, for better or worse. Perhaps they simply didn't want to exchange an overlord they didn't know for, an overlord they knew for one that they didn't know. Better the devil you know. Now, Cyrus shows, great bravery and leadership in bringing Croesus to battle. They fight this, huge battle, and one of the tactics that Cyrus uses is putting camels in his front row, because the smell of camels are very strange and exotic, and it scared the Lydian horses, the cavalry who'd never seen or smelt a camel before, and so they ran away, and Croesus's army collapsed, and Cyrus wins through bravery and strategy, and he finally brings Ionia into Persian control. So that's the whole of kind of modern day Turkey, brought under the control of Cyrus the Great in 547 BC. So Cyrus probably, whilst showing a reasonable degree of political sophistication and not outright barbarity, is perhaps not really challenging Persian stereotypes with his relentless desire to conquer. So he starts off in Persia and then conquers the Median Empire and then conquers the Lydian Empire, and then turns to one of the oldest, greatest civilizations in the East, the Babylonian or Neo-Babylonian Empire. So in a sense, perhaps he is meeting with the Greek stereotype of these Persians having this relentless thirst for conquest. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire is quite an interesting one, and Cyrus's invasion of it is extremely important, because this is where we start to get some of the visual material, and so we need to have a really deep understanding, or not necessarily deep, very clear understanding of what's going on. So at the time, 539, Babylon was ruled by a Babylonian king called Nabonidus, who was a deeply unpopular, tyrannical ruler, and he was very, very unpopular for a variety of reasons. It's not completely clear, but it seems to be his neglect of Babylonian religion. It's possible he tried to refocus Babylonian religion, or introduce a new deity, or focus worship on a deity called Sin, which is, I think, a moon goddess, and that's why I put Sin worshipper up there. So Nabonidus is changing forcefully the way people worship and showing great disrespect to the gods. Now, Cyrus wants to take Babylon. It's a rich, powerful but weakening, very important sort of cultural territory that he'll need to capture to secure his vast empire at this point. Now, it would seem that maybe some of the Babylonians revolted, possibly the Akkadians, who are part of the Babylonian Empire. It's all a little bit murky and unclear. But anyway, possibly in support of this rebellion, Cyrus invades Babylon, and he crushes Nabonidus at the Battle of Opis, and then marches towards the city of Babylon itself. Now, there's a bit of a variation in stories here. So many of the Babylonian / Middle Eastern authors don't actually mention any fight over the city of Babylon. They say the city of Babylon surrendered almost instantly after this battle. Now, Herodotus tells a story about how the city resists, and so Cyrus diverts a river to capture Babylon. So the river was running along the walls of Babylon, and they couldn't cross it. So Cyrus does its huge engineering works and diverts the river so that it drops down to sort of ankle height, and then the men can walk across. So again, this is a kind of classic example of sort of Persian geoengineering. So, and other sources don't really mention this. So perhaps Herodotus is trying to create this stereotype of Persian kings who change the world. This is Cyrus doing it, and Xerxes is changing of the Hellespont and the canal at Athos are bigger, bolder, more hubristic things that Persian kings do. Anyway, however he does it, Cyrus captures Babylon. And bear in mind what would often happen at this point. You've got sacking of cities, you've got enslavement, you've got a very sort of domineering, controlling approach. You come in, you stamp your authority on people, they just do what you say. Cyrus does seem to have taken a very different approach. So, according to the Nabonidus Chronicle, written by people from Babylon, although it must be remembered after Cyrus's conquest, the people of Babylon received Cyrus with joy. So Cyrus marches in as a liberator, someone freeing the people of Babylon from an oppressive tyrant. Now, another work. So we see another account on one of these wonderful cylinder scrolls, and you can just see it in the picture there. So it would be cuneiform words wrapped around a cylinder, and then you roll it out on a piece of clay, and then it kind of prints what's on the scroll out nice and flat. So quite a cool little piece of technology, and we'll see a more famous version in a bit. So anyway, you've got the Nabonidus verse account, which is on one of these cylinder scrolls. So what I would like you to do is have a read through. You've got the text on a Word document. And answer the question. How does Cyrus's behaviour compare to Greek stereotypes of Persians when he invades this city? So stop, identify, so underline and analyse. So here Cyrus does this, blah, 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 blah. So stop, take 5-10 minutes and have a go at that. So couple of key points. So Cyrus comes in and he declares peace. He shows, which is a positive thing, not something that Persian kings are particularly associated with as far as the Greeks are concerned. He comes in and he offers a lot of key sacrifices, a lot of very important sacrifices. He shows great respect to the gods, and interestingly, he shows great respect to the Babylonian gods. And remember that Cyrus would be Zoroastrian, or a kind of early version of that. So he's showing great respect to the gods of a conquered or allied people. And compare this to Xerxes and Darius, who almost relentlessly burn down temples and sanctuaries and shrines and behave appallingly. You remember Xerxes on the Acropolis butchering people who are clinging to the statue of Athene and begging for sanctuary from her. So we've got a very different image of Persians in comparison of Persian kings. When we look at this cylinder seal in comparison to Herodotus' depiction of Xerxes. Now, is that really more about Xerxes, or is it just a different understanding of Persian kings and their role? Now, another thing that he does is he starts to rebuild the city of Babylon. And this is quite a humble thing, isn't it? He picks up the hoe, the spade, and the water basket. The tools of the simple labourer, and he starts rebuilding bits of the wall. And he does it according to the old plan of Nebuchadnezzar, an ancient Babylonian king. So again, he's showing great respect to the traditions of these Babylonian people who are not Persians. He's showing a great degree of kind of humbleness in doing manual labour. This isn't Xerxes in his scented carriage, or his gold carriage. This seems to be quite a different type of king. Good. Anyway, I'm sure you got those kinds of things. So that brings us on to our piece of set visual material, the Cyrus cylinder, a cylinder produced by the people of Babylon, detailing the story of the decline of Nabonidus and the beneficial rule of Cyrus. And again, we need to be a little bit careful with regard to provenance, because this was produced after Cyrus had already won. So taken perhaps with a pinch of salt, but a very, very famous document, for want of a better word, and one that we can see and will see when we head up to the British Museum. Some have declared it to be one of the first ever universal declarations of human rights. I think a little bit strong, perhaps, but it is interesting that an invading king is laying out a document promoting tolerance and integration and the duty of a king to rule appropriately and properly, rather than simply saying we're coming in and taking all your stuff. So we'll have a look at the text of the cylinder in a little bit and do a little bit of work on that. But what I would like to do now is to have a look at the second mass lit video, which covers again a bit more of the Cyrus story and looks at the Cyrus cylinder in a little bit of detail. Do take notes, especially on analytical arguments. And once you've done that, a task for you using the Cyrus cylinder text. Now I know the text is a bit weird, it's a little bit fragmentary, it's not a flowing story like Homer or Herodotus or Aeschylus, and it's a little bit of a strange piece of visual material because the visual material is supposed to be about the visuals rather than the text. But anyway, you do need to have an understanding of some of the key elements of the text or examples of the text. So what I would like you to do is read through the text, highlight and then explain why there are areas that challenge Greek stereotypes of Persians. Highlight and explain why there are areas that support Greek stereotypes of Persians. And then highlight areas that show how the Persians controlled their empire. So have a go at that. It should take 10 minutes or so. Brilliant, well done. That's not including watching the video. Lovely. So, what happens to Cyrus? Well, there is a great story in Herodotus 1214, where we see an exotic figure called Tomiris, queen of the Massagetæ, and Cyrus ends up, according to Herodotus, having his head cut off by Tomiris and then sewn into a bag of blood. So great story. So read quickly Herodotus 1.214 to see what happens to Cyrus the Great, at least according to Herodotus. Now, whatever happens to Cyrus, he dies, as do we all, and he is placed in the final piece of Vismat for today, and that is the tomb of Cyrus. Now, the tomb of Cyrus was built at a place called Pasargadae, the early Persian capital, although talking about Persian capital cities is a very complex business given that there are nomadic people, it's a strange empire, they've got tons and tons of Persian capitals like Susa, like Pasargadae, like Persepolis, so it's a slight, in some ways it's a meaningless phrase or word, but anyway, it is a very important city for the Persians, and it is, well, it is a city. It is, well, one could argue, yeah, I think we can argue it's a city, but it's a strange city in some ways, and that's where Cyrus's tomb is. And surrounding this city, or surrounding this tomb, were these gardens of these well-kept, beautiful gardens, and the word garden in effect means paradise. Now, the tomb is a strange object in some ways. It's a very sort of big, solid stone tomb, not something the Persians were really famous for building, and it was certainly been built, at least in part, by stonemasons from Lydia, from Ionia, so the Lydians, the Ionian Greeks. Probably not many Persians had a hand in it, and we can probably see some of the architectural influences from Ionia and Lydia. But there's also Mesopotamian influences. This has got the outline of what's, or influence of what we can see of what's called a ziggurat, these stepped pyramids that you can see kind of below the tomb there. So it's a kind of interesting building in many ways. It shows a whole variety of cultural influences and a cultural mishmash, and perhaps, not necessarily a start, but perhaps Cyrus, or at least the builders of his tomb, acknowledging the kind of complex cultural interactions that make up the Persian Empire. Good. Okay, well, that is the first of the Persian reality lessons. Well done, and I'll see you in the next lesson.